This also assumes that everybody's going to be doing their homework, right? And generally speaking, when you have a chair of a subcommittee that will draft the content, and you have subcommittee members that will then review that content on their own time and bleed on the ink, so to speak, and do that homework, then when you have that subcommittee meeting, it's typically much more productive at that point. And if all of that homework is done, then at the consensus body level, again, we find a much greater level of efficacy or efficiency. If you'll advance one more slide for me. Then we get into the third kind of pillar or bucket, rather, of the standard development process for new standards, and that's the section drafts themselves. Again, this is subcommittee driven, and my advisement to our consensus bodies that are working with new standards is really push that content development down into the subcommittee level wherever possible and wherever practical. Then have the consensus body be the consensus part of that process, right? And again, as standards leaders, as chairs and vice chairs, what this requires is it requires a lot of accountability. It requires a lot of attention being driven towards assignments and agendas, holding people accountable to reviewing content prior to meetings. The ideal case is, for example, that we have a subcommittee that has drafted Section 3, whatever it is. That subcommittee has notified the chair and vice chair that we are at a point where we have a draft, and we would like the consensus body's eyes on this draft so that we can see whether or not we have consensus on the content. Then there should be time given for the consensus body to read that on their own time, right? Not necessarily reviewing it line by line within a consensus body meeting, right? That should be the point where we're discussing observations that we've already had, not necessarily having those observations for the first time in person in a consensus body meeting. I know generally that's kind of where our consensus bodies very often kind of regress to, is reviewing content line by line in a consensus body meeting. It does get the job done, but the problem with that process is it's very slow. The process also creates a lot of potential conflict in the document because we're looking at the tree and not the forest when we review a document that way, right? If I'm looking at a single sentence and I'm thinking of the context of that sentence for the first time in a consensus body meeting, and we discuss that sentence, we edit that sentence, that doesn't necessarily have the ability for my perception of what needs to change in that particular context across that entire section. But if I've taken the opportunity to read the entire section and then take my notes on the section and then bring my subjects to the consensus body, the core subjects I have issue with, now we have context for the full section. And again, it requires that homework is done, right? It requires that we're looking at that ahead of time. If you'll advance one more slide for me. So that kind of gives us an overview of the standard writing from a new standard perspective. When we approach the process in that way, again, just reviewing the pillars, it gives us an opportunity when we follow a process like that for consensus on the scope, consensus on the outline, and then sending that work out to the subcommittee level so that we can then prepare and do the content development outside of the consensus body process. It allows the consensus body then to focus just on consensus. It requires that we have a check and balance for accountability. What generally I would recommend there is that there is a method by which we're tracking the status of each of the sections, ask for a % completion at each consensus body meeting, and schedule those sections to be brought back to the consensus body with plenty of notice so that folks know that in 3 weeks, we're going to have to present this. So it gives kind of a little bit of a fire underneath that particular subcommittee to get the work done. But it also requires that each consensus body member is participating in subcommittees. And it also requires that each consensus body member is reviewing content prior to consensus body meetings, right? So a lot of accountability. Now let's take those pillars and move to the second process, and that is the standards revision of existing standards. So in the process for standard revision of existing standards, here I would put these into 3 main buckets for the actual content work, at least. One is Phase 1, the open revision proposal process that we'll take a look at and unpack. Phase 2 is the approved revision drafting, which is the second phase. And then 3, the third phase, is your consolidated draft review. From a high level, what this looks like is there's a period of time in which anyone on the consensus body can openly say, here is an area of the document that I think needs to be changed, and here's why I think it needs to be changed. It lets the consensus body hear the argument and decide, do we have consensus that that change needs to happen, right, before any work is done. The second phase then allows the individuals that presented that, if there is consensus for the change, to go work on that change in the subcommittee and then bring that information back and have the consensus body approve or disapprove whether or not the change is beneficial, right? Does this change better document what is standard of care? Yes or no? Once those approvals are made on any developments, then the final phase is to put all of those approved changes into a consolidated draft and review the consolidated draft as a whole in preparation for public review. So let's unpack these. Let's kind of dig into them a little bit deeper. If you'll advance one slide for me. And let's talk about the first phase. Now, this particular process, we have taken some time to document in good detail. Not only do we have some supporting forms that are available to consensus bodies to help manage through this process, we have actually documented the process into kind of like a standard operating procedure that gives some good guidance based on the experiences with the process so far by those that have used it. The first step in that, like I said, is the open proposal period. That's the first phase. And in that open proposal period, what is being asked of consensus body members is review the standard, review your notes of using the standard for the last 4 or 5 years, and based on your review, the issues that you've seen in industry, the new information that has become available to industry, document for us what revision you would like to see made, and be very specific, right? What is the title of the change? Give it some sort of a title so we can identify it. Give us a brief summary of the change, just at a high level in a single paragraph. Say, what is it that you would like to change? Give us your basis. So what is the argument that supports the change? Why is this a critical change? Give us your sources or references. Is there information, authoritative information that supports that change? And then finally, last but not least, and definitely not least, what language in the document is impacted by the change? Which sections, which subsections are impacted by the change? Once this form is complete, this form is provided to the chair and vice chair, and it's reviewed at the consensus body level. The individual that prepared the form says, here's what I'd like to do. Here's why I'd like to do it. Here's all my supporting information. Here are my references. Here is the scope of the change. So all of the areas in the document that this will impact. You then discuss it as a consensus body. You argue for it. You argue against it. Maybe make modifications to it based on those arguments. Once the discussion is done, a motion is made by the individual who prepared the form. A second must be established by the consensus body in order to hear the vote. It's voted. If approved, then the individual who prepared the document is most likely going to be the chair that will charge forward and begin drafting that change. Again, my word of caution on this, same as it was with a new standard, as chairs and vice chairs, just be cognizant of how many subjects an individual will chair, and ensure that love kind of gets spread around the consensus body, so to speak. Once this is approved, you move forward. You have a subcommittee that works this. Now, a critical note here is that this first phase should be a limited window. And this is super, super critical. The proposal phase, the open proposal phase, has the name open proposal phase on purpose. One of the things that your consensus body in revision should decide early within your consensus body is, how long do you want to leave this open? Is this a 3-month window? Is this a 4-month window? Right? How long will any proposal that is prepared be automatically heard by the consensus body? Give it a timeline, give it a due date. And the reason you need to do that is because you want to avoid feature creep on the standard, where you're 2 years into your revision process, and then all of a sudden a proposal comes forward that just blows the whole process up and you're back to square one. If we don't put some control on that, then the revision process would be just an infinite timeline where all the goodness of everything that your consensus body has done will not get out to industry because there are other changes that keep slowing it down. So put a window on it, right? Put a timeline on it and say, our open revision proposal period will end after 90 days on this date. Okay. And that's it. right? After that period, there is no open proposal process. There's still a proposal process, but the proposal process will look a little bit different. At that point, if you have something that you've decided that you want to put in as a proposal, after that window is expired, the chair and the vice chair must hear it and accept it and bring it into the agenda. And if they decide that that's a wonderful change, but we're going to kick that down to the road to the next consensus body, then that's exactly what's going to happen, right? At that point, the chair and the vice chair, just like they must hear a motion on the floor, they must hear the proposal to bring it to the floor. Okay. So that's the open proposal process and the open proposal period. Again, the critical nature of this document, when you think about the pillars of the process, this gives the consensus body an opportunity in that revision to ensure that we have consensus on the fact that this change is warranted. We also have consensus on the reasons why the change is warranted. And then finally, we have consensus on which sections this change will address. That then gives that individual that's going to chair that subcommittee, it gives them the guidelines to know exactly where their boundaries are for what they're going to go attack, where they're going to make revisions, what that revision is going to do, and what the purpose of that revision is, right? Knowing full well that they have the consensus of the body, and when they bring this back, right, it's not going to get blown up because somebody disagrees wholeheartedly with the change, right? It gives us that precision. It gives us that clarity. If you'll advance one slide for me. Second bucket or second phase is then working through those revision proposals. And in this part of the process, the Excel spreadsheet that you see on the right-hand side is the method that we've used thus far. I'm sure this could be modified slightly to be even more effective, but this form has served those that have used it so far, at least, has served those individuals quite well. And what this form basically does is it gives me an opportunity to capture the title of any proposal that was made, right? Who submitted the proposal and whether or not the proposal was accepted by the consensus body. If it is approved, then we move forward and say, was a subcommittee formed? Has that subcommittee begun work? At what phase is that work currently? It gives me the ability to track notes against that status of that particular subcommittee. And what this basically becomes is it becomes the driver for your agenda at the consensus body meetings, right? The first step in a consensus body meeting will be to pull up this form after, of course, we do roll call in minutes, but we pull up this form and we say, okay, here are all of the approved proposals. You call on the individual that has submitted those if they were approved, and you get an update, right? Where's your subcommittee now? How far along are you with the work? How much more time do you need? And when can we put you on the agenda to present your content to the consensus body? And you continue to roll through these proposals until you get to the point where some of these proposals are ready for presentation back to the consensus body, right? Once they're ready to roll back to the consensus body, then that gets presented to the body with notice. And that's critical, with notice. So if, for example, the subject on time, agitation, chemical, and temperature revision by the S100 is ready for revision or review, rather, by the consensus body, then that redrafted language should be posted to the workspace. The agenda should be posted for the following week, saying a week from now, we're going to review this content. So as a consensus body, please review the information that has been prepared by the subcommittee. The more effectively your members are reviewing that information before the meeting, the more effective the review of the content will be in the meeting, right? Ideally, again, the ideal state is when we come to that meeting, I, as a consensus body member, already know, based on the revisions, what my thoughts are. And I have 2 or 3 suggestions for revision that I've already got written down, and that's what I'm bringing to discussion. What I'm hoping to avoid is a line-by-line read of all of the content wherever possible, and line-by-line editing by the consensus body. All right. Again, it works, but it's very slow, it's very myopic, and it oftentimes has the opportunity for creating conflict if I'm not considering where I want to see change in something I didn't necessarily participate in drafting if I'm not looking at the context of the entire section as a whole, right? Reading the section prior to the meeting is the only way to accomplish that. All right. So that is the proposal review process, or the revision of drafts process. Let's go and advance one more slide. The next phase, or the final phase of the content development, at least for standard revision, is consolidated draft review. And the way that the consolidated draft review, again, is best managed, the ideal state, is that we take each section one at a time, that a meeting is dedicated to a particular section. Everybody on the consensus body is aware of which section is going to be reviewed in that call. You have a week to prepare your thoughts and your comments, to review the section, to note what it is that you want to discuss with the consensus body. So again, we can avoid that line by line read wherever possible. We then have our meeting. The first paragraph, second paragraph, and third paragraph are put on screen. We call, is there a comment on these paragraphs from prior review? No, we move to the next group of paragraphs. Is there a comment? No, we move to the next set of paragraphs. Is there a comment? Yes. Okay. What's the comment? We have discussion around the comment. We make any revisions that are necessary based on the comment, and we move through the section. The section is then moved and approved by the consensus body. So that's the ideal state, right? That's the ideal state that we're shooting for in the consolidated draft review. So with that, I wanted to make sure that we had enough time to kind of review also the pillars here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to the next slide. So now kind of zooming back out and taking a high level review of everything that we just walked through, I want to kind of go back through and discuss again these pillars and why these pillars I'm presenting to you are critical to the work that we do in standards in light of the processes that we just ran through. First and foremost, again, and I can't hit this hard enough, especially in just kind of taking back a step from that, especially given the fact that I have been over the course of the last year or so very passionate about the documentation of these processes for how we go about developing new standards or how we go about revising a standard. I always want to take a step back from that and ensure that as volunteers for standards development, we all understand that regardless of the process that we put forward as a standards leadership team to you as volunteers, none of that replaces the consensus of your body, right? The content that we shared with you yesterday, the processes that I'm outlining for you today, at the end of the day, what's most important is consensus, right? You as a group, you as a body, you've been selected. You've been picked from applicants because of your subject matter expertise, because of your applications that represent your particular interest categories to balance out a committee that is developing a standard for our industry to use as a consensus developed standard. So consensus is key. All right, consensus is key. And I don't want anything that I've shared with you today or that you've heard for the course of the last 48 hours or prior to trump that. Secondarily, I feel it's critical that with that consensus, that we as a group have thorough but efficient documentation of what we're publishing to the industry. Because of how critical what we're saying and documenting is to the industry, the livelihood of those that use those documents, the liability of those that use those documents, the financial impact of 2 or 3 words in a standard can be massive. Right. So for that reason, I think we have a responsibility to ensure that as we are gaining consensus on these standards, that we document that consensus, that we document what informs that consensus. So one of the reasons why I am presenting these processes to you as a group of volunteers in the way that I am is because intrinsically, these processes provide that documentation. And although we have track changes and we have minutes and we have these types of instruments that do capture and document kind of the critical documentation that must be there from an ANSI perspective, that doesn't necessarily address the why, the how, and the where behind the statements that we're making in our standards. So by using these processes just intrinsically, that's going to document that for us by using these proposal forms, for example. The background that supports the reason why we're doing what we're doing is there. For those that have gone through public comment and gone into a public comment period, just imagine for a moment that process and just how grueling that process can be, right? And it can be very painstaking. It can take an exorbitant amount of time, especially when somebody's provided a comment on language that you as a consensus body argued and voted 4 years ago, And that's the reality of it in many cases, right? Because of the life of a single cycle of a consensus body, it could easily have been 4 years ago that you and two other consensus body members had a debate on a particular area and settled out and voted language as a consensus body on that debate, right? Now, 4 years later, you've got somebody that's challenging that language, remembering why the language was written the way that it was can be a challenge, right? So imagine for a moment that I've got a proposal document that has the exact basis for why the revision was made and all of the supporting language that impacted that change to inform my response in public comment. It makes that process, a lot easier to manage, especially around contentious topics. And our standards are generally, addressing very contentious topics, right? That's the reason why standards need to be there, is because some of these topics are contentious. This process also allows for precision and clarity, right? By ensuring that we do the homework to document what it is that we are developing and why we're developing it, what we're revising and why we're revising it, to get consensus on those revisions, to do the homework and review the content ahead of time and come prepared to these meetings with these comments ready to go instead of reviewing line by line. It allows us to be much more precise and much more clear with our language, right? Harmonization is the piece that is probably least addressed by these processes. And harmonization is an area, like I said, as a group, we're climbing a mountain. And we've begun climbing that mountain. I think we have a feel for just how tall the mountain is, but we're still learning our way. And this is the area where I feel personally just I personally have the most angst at the current present time, because I see the struggles of our volunteers in areas where we're coming at harmonization with other standards within our organization, where there isn't a really good, clear process. And we're trying to learn that process. We're trying to kind of feel our way in the dark and figure out, how do we best go about this? And we've come at it from a couple of different angles. We've come at it from a couple of different ways. I've seen feelings hurt because of it. And I've seen, phenomenal end results because of it, with great harmonization and great synergy. So my ask with harmonization is, understand that we're learning how to do this. Understand that we are, first of all, committed to doing it, right? Because our standards need to be harmonized with one another while honoring consensus. But we are learning our way. And anything that any of us have to inform that process and to make it work better for the next attempt, I am 100% all ears, right, in how we come at and attack this. So those are the 4 pillars. If we honor these as the pillars for how we're approaching the process, and if we take the guidance of these processes for new standard development and existing standards and put them to work, I think that what we already produce, which are phenomenal documents as we move forward in the ANSI IICRC standards development, will only improve and only get better. These are living processes. These are not processes being dictated to our individual consensus bodies, as some of those that are working with these processes understand. That there are reasons why you may need to amend and modify some of these steps to fit what it is that your consensus body is out to accomplish. My only ask is that as you embrace these processes, if you're finding that there are tweaks and modifications that can benefit the process, share them with me. Right, share them with myself or anybody on our team at the standards leadership team, with the intent of making the processes even better for the next consensus body that is going to put those processes to work. Okay. So with that, I know with this, there are a lot of things that can be discussed. There are a lot of questions I'm sure that the group has. And listening to somebody present virtually for an hour is probably about the max. So let's roll this over into some open discussion, into some Q&A. If you'll advance one more slide for me. And the way that this is going to work for the Q&A period, I'm sure Millie will probably also articulate this, but be very critical that any question is spoken directly into the microphone for those of us that are here virtually. So with that, I'll hand the floor back to Millie to facilitate Q&A.